What actually turns a photographer into an artist? It's easy to assume the answer is better photographs. Stronger composition, better timing, a more refined body of work. Photographic culture often treats artistic development as a gradual sharpening of visual skill. Images become more controlled, frames become more intentional. Over time, the work appears more confident. But that explanation starts to fall apart the longer you work. Something deeper seems to be unfolding long before the photograph itself exists. Cheers, I'm Brian, and this is The Thinking Camera. Welcome back. In the previous episode, I explored the idea that a photographer's own life can become an important part of their work. A few viewers interpreted that idea as a suggestion that photographers should simply document their daily lives, turning the camera inward as a kind of personal record. That interpretation misses the nuance that I was trying to describe, so I want to clarify the idea before I go any further. The photographer's life is rarely the literal subject of the work. More often, it acts as the underlying influence that shapes how the work appears. The places we move through and the rhythms of our days and the experiences that accumulate over time quietly shape the way that we see. A couple weeks ago, while waiting for a portrait session to begin at a local park, I noticed a tree standing in the fog at the edge of an open field. The light and the separation of the branches from the background made the structure of the photograph immediately clear. The visual structure is legible almost immediately. A solitary subject separated from its surroundings. Fog settling into the distance. Branches forming a clear graphic pattern against the sky. The photograph presents itself almost fully formed before the shutter even clicks. Images like this tend to follow visual principles that become familiar over time. Isolation, contrast, atmosphere, recognizable shape. The scene contains the ingredients that make a photograph legible within the language of the medium. Yet those photographs also triggered a different line of thought. They raised a question about how artistic work actually develops over time. When photographers talk about bringing their lives into their work, the idea can easily be misunderstood. The phrase sometimes sounds as if the artist's life should literally become the subject of the photographs, as though the camera should function as a diary recording the events of daily experience. That interpretation misses something more subtle. The artist is not the subject of the art. The artist's life seems to function more as an influence that shapes how the work appears. Those tree photographs didn't emerge from a landscape excursion or a deliberate search for scenery. They were made in a small interval before work began, during a slow walk through the park while waiting for a client to arrive. The camera happened to be present, but more importantly, attention happened to be active. The fog, the spacing of the branches, and the separation of the tree from the background revealed a visual structure that invited the photograph. The photographs appear to have emerged from that condition of attention rather than from the pursuit of a subject. Artists in many disciplines have described a similar relationship between lived experience and creative work. In the 19th century, the American minister and writer Henry Ward Beecher observed that every artist dips his brush in his own soul and paints his own nature into his pictures. Beecher was not arguing that paintings function autobiographically. His observation was that temperament, experience, and character inevitably shape the work that emerges from the artist's hand. The modernist artist and educator Josef Albers articulated the idea in more formal terms while teaching at the Bauhaus and later at Black Mountain College. Albers wrote that the content of art is the visual formulation of our relation to life. In this view, art does not simply reproduce the external world. It gives visible structure to the way an individual experiences that world. Seen through this lens, the photograph can begin to feel like more than a representation of a subject. It becomes evidence of perception. The frame reveals not only what was present in front of the camera, but also the habits of attention that allow the photographer to recognize meaning in that moment. The American philosopher John Dewey approached a similar idea from a slightly different direction in his 1934 book, Art as Experience. Dewey argued that artistic perception disrupts what he called routine consciousness, the habitual mode in which daily life unfolds without close examination. Streets, rooms, landscapes, and ordinary environments pass by without demanding much attention. Experience becomes background. Art interrupts that condition. It can restore an active encounter with the world, allowing ordinary situations to appear structured and vivid again. The familiar becomes newly visible. Photography illustrates this shift particularly clearly. In the early stages, the camera often functions as a planned activity. A photographer goes out to make pictures. A walk through the city is organized around finding subjects. A trip is structured around photographing a landscape. The act of photographing stands apart from the rest of the day. With enough time behind the camera, that separation can begin to dissolve. Photography becomes less of an activity and more of a condition of awareness. The eye seems to become attuned to relationships that might otherwise remain unnoticed. Reflections appear in windows that previously seemed ordinary. The angle of light across a wall suggests a composition. A single tree emerging from fog becomes visually legible as a photograph. The image itself is the visible outcome of that awareness, while the deeper change appears to take place in perception. Seen this way, artistic development is difficult to reduce to production of more photographs alone. The more significant change lies in the gradual formation of a mindset. The photographer begins to move through the world differently, guided by a persistent habit of attention that quietly reshapes how experience is interpreted. The Chinese artist Ai Weiwei described the relationship between life and art in strikingly simple terms during an interview about his practice. Life is art is life. I never separate it. His work ranges from sculpture and architecture to political installation, yet the principle behind the statement is straightforward. Living and making art gradually become intertwined processes rather than separate activities. Once that connection forms, a feedback loop begins to appear. Life influences the work, and the work begins to influence the life being lived. Experience shapes perception, and perception reshapes the way the experience is interpreted. Over time, the two become difficult to separate. The trees photographed that day illustrate this idea in a modest way. They stand in a park that people pass through every day. Nothing about them demands a photograph. What matters is the moment when attention recognizes a visual relationship. The instant when fog, space, and form align in a way that reveals structure. That recognition does not originate in the trees themselves. It originates in the act of looking. This is why photographs often reveal something about the photographer, even when the subject appears unrelated. A photograph of a street or a landscape does not only show the place being photographed, it also reveals the perspective of the person who chose that framing, that moment, and that interpretation of the scene. Over time, a body of work begins to reveal more than the subject it contains. It reveals a pattern of attention. It reveals how a particular individual moves through the world and what kinds of visual relationships consistently attract their perception. The question that opened this discussion begins to look different when seen from that perspective. The transformation from photographer to artist may have less to do with the photographs themselves than with the mindset that produces them. Artistic work grows out of attention. Attention grows out of experience, and experience unfolds inside the life the photographer is already living. The photographs become the visible traces of that process. Which returns the thought to those two images of a tree in the fog. They're simple photographs made during an ordinary interval before another assignment began, yet they carry within them the accumulated influence of years spent noticing visual structure in the world. If someone encounters your photographs without knowing anything about you, the subjects will always be visible, but something else may also appear beneath the surface, a pattern of attention, a consistent way of seeing that developed slowly through experience, which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment. When people encounter your photographs, are they only seeing the subjects in front of the camera, or are they beginning to glimpse the deeper habits of perception that shaped the decision to stop, look carefully, and make the photograph at all? Thanks for listening.